Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We will start in a minute or two. We are just waiting for a few more people to log in and get settled. Thank you. Hello, and thank you for joining us. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Please note all your lines have been muted to reduce any background noise, and we hope you take full advantage of the question and answer pod on the left side of your screen to ask any questions throughout the presentation. If we are unable to get to your questions, our team will follow up with you offline. This webcast is being recorded, and a link will be sent out in a follow-up email for you to view it again or share with a colleague. On behalf of Ping Identity and Carahsoft, I would like to welcome you to today's webcast, Implications of New Zero Trust Guidance for Federal Agencies. Before I introduce today's speaker panel, I'd like to tell you just a little bit about Carahsoft. Carahsoft is a government IT solutions provider and industry-leading technology products, services, and a training federal, state, local, and education customers on behalf of top-tier manufacturers like Ping Identity, AWS, Splunk, Adobe, and VMware. Our contact information will be at the end of the presentation, so please don't hesitate to contact us for any of your needs. We are pleased to offer one continuing professional education or CPE credit to those that attend today's webinar. In order to qualify for the credit, you must be present, registering your attendance by signing in with your full name and actively participating in the polling questions throughout the entirety of the webinar. For more information on the CPE credits we are offering, our CPE sponsor NASPA, and the submission process, please click the link on your screen. If you meet all of today's requirements, you will receive your certificate of completion within 2 weeks. At this time, I'd like to introduce our speakers for today's webcast. Ross Foard, ICAM SME and engineer at CISA, Matt Topper, president of UberEther, and Brian Rosensteel, solutions architect at Ping Identity. Ross, Matt, Brian, the floor is all yours.
Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you much. So we had a similar talk about this stuff about what, a month and a half ago, and received some awesome feedback. Honestly, it's probably one of the best sessions I've done like this in the last 18 months, with some really great discussion coming in from the participants, as well as obviously Ross's brain and what's actually happening in the federal space right now around Zero Trust, MFA, and all the other additional executive orders and pieces going on. This time we've asked Brian Rosensteel, Chief Federal Architect from Ping, to join us to dive down deep a little bit more into some of these topics and discussions. And again, we really invite the attendees to put in your questions. What's bugging you? What is hard? What is not clear in your own zero trust journeys and planning right now that we can help maybe provide some guidance or shed some light onto the what's, whys, and hows to actually get this done all together. So with that, I think we'll just start with the big elephant in the room. And Ross, you're the guy that's most in the middle of this. It has been just over a month here since the comments and responses went back in. I've heard that the government got a lot of feedback from both internal and other agencies as well as commercial. What can you tell us that's gone on since that's been put in?
So, the three big documents we talked about, right, are the zero trust strategy, and that was done by OMB. And there's been conversations we've had with OMB, and they're having deliberations amongst themselves and their other parties that they work with. They received quite a few comments, and so I think they're in the process of updating the strategy, right? The zero trust maturity model, that's a CISA product, and I think that we've had a few comments, on that too, and I think while it's pretty sound, we're taking everybody's comments in, and we'll be updating that. I haven't heard a whole lot of deviations, at least in the zero trust maturity model, that kind of affects our vision of identity management. I think there are questions about, how do you implement things, and how does this implementation look like as you go from, where we are traditionally and we evolve into something that is optimal, right? And those questions around, how do PEPs operate, what are the policy decision points, and I've been just telling people that I believe that, at least for the interim, a lot of these policy decision points and the PEPs that enforce policies, they're going to be serialized. So you just think about how these different kind of product domains operate these days. You have people that can do identity and access management, and they do access decisions, but you need to incorporate into that maybe some devices, right? And device identity, device health, those will probably be a series of decisions based upon different controllers and different policy set in those controllers. And then you move beyond that into, it depends on how the architecture is inside your environment, right? So all of those pillars are going to be represented in some way. I think, and I think that's probably one of the things that'll come out maybe a little bit in the updating of the maturity model about, how these things all work together, right? And then when we talk about the cloud security, that technical reference architecture, I think a lot of people were kind of surprised, and I fielded a number of questions about the emphasis that was on DevSecOps, because really that really changes the way people operate in their environments. And I think but it is very important, particularly if you're developing software that you're delivering through the cloud, that you need to be able to react to events and to things you find about it in a structured but really rapid manner, right? And so I think the DevSecOps model does a really good job of expressing that ability to match agility with structure, because you build the process structure in place so that you can move through that with agility. So, nothing really radical there, right? And I'll just say all these documents are being reviewed. I haven't seen a publication date for a final on any of them yet. That doesn't mean that somebody doesn't have one. I haven't seen that yet.
Sure. No. So I guess, Brian, obviously you've got an industry viewpoint on what came out. What was your personal, maybe not even ping the company you work for's thoughts on the docs and where it hit well and where it might have maybe missed?
Well, I mean, the two documents, basically when you had the three up, the ones on the ends, I think were the most. I'm not gonna say. Well, one shocked me personally. Right, when I looked at the federal zero trust strategy and I saw the kind of language they put around multi-factor authentication, and really the entire story around ICAM in general, right? I took three takeaways, right? Have to implement SSO, centralized identity, use phishing resistant MFA, and that really struck me because we've never seen anything like that, and the strength of the language that was in there. And I'll come back to that one in a second. The other one was kind of to hit back on what Ross was saying around DevSecOps and how pertinent that was within the cloud security, TRA. And I'm not going to say a dance to jig, but as someone who enjoys these types of documents more than any normal human should, I really got a kick out of that because I'm like, yeah, finally. And I think the reason why that's so important was that to me was that's the biggest lesson learned from the cloud. Everyone always looks at the cloud. What's the strength of the cloud? Well, the strength of the cloud is in order for a vendor, in order to be able to operate it efficiently, you have to have very agile practices in place. And you also have to make sure that you're constantly updating it, right? When you think about annual audits you're gonna have to go through for things like FedRAMP and things like that, you can't be static in your implementations or you're gonna get hammered all at once at a certain time of the year, right? You have to be anticipating those and have that kind of dynamic, flexible management in place. That's that strength. Well, that doesn't have to be exclusive to the cloud. You can operate that internally within your environment. And that's what, DevSecOps or DevOps, whatever you want to call it, has been kind of champion for years. So I was totally thrilled to see that. On that federal zero trust strategy document, though, when you saw, we're going to have SSO everywhere, we're going to have everything centralized. First thing I thought was the last few decades of building in identity silos, hopefully it's coming to an end. That doesn't mean that everything has to just be in one giant directory, but it does mean that finally we're going to allow ourselves for flexible central policy management, right? And that's so critical, I think, as we look forward. The same general story about being agile. So I was super thrilled about that. The phishing resistant MFA piece, I didn't expect. We had seen NIST really change things when they switched away from LOA over to IAL, AAL, and FAL. And when you looked at 863 B, specifically around AAL, and you saw that kind of flexibility in the models they had in there, I wasn't expecting things to go back stringent. I'm not saying it doesn't make sense. It really does when you look at it from a security perspective. But I think that took a lot of people by surprise. And we saw that when we looked at, what people were doing when they were hitting Ping's website, nearly overnight, all of a sudden, Ping, or not Ping, PKI enablement and PIV and all of that just went through the roof of what people were searching and trying to figure out as they shore up applications that they thought maybe they would be using a different type of authenticator for.
Yeah, no, it's, even at our size, we saw the same thing. People talking about identity, people talking about MFA, zero trust in these blog articles, like stats went through the roof, and I was like, all right, this hit home big time. And Carousel team, if you wouldn't mind putting up our first CPE question. So we're gonna let you all answer this behind the scenes, and then we'll come back to it in a few minutes. But our first question is, do you feel that you have the agency-wide zero trust philosophy needed to move cybersecurity forward? And yeah, this is loaded, we know. But we'll come back to it in a few. And I guess along those lines, that's one of the, I agree on the DevSecOps side, unless you've operated in that environment and can see that, oh wait, we can actually enforce a policy within minutes of problems being seen, or within days of a new executive order coming out, and things like, hey, things of this criticality level need to have this level of MFA on it. Before we were like, see in 3 years. But in some of the environments like the Air Force and the Army that we've been working in, those things can happen literally overnight. And rolling a new 0-day patch or a new update is really a non-event anymore, which is incredibly different than a lot of the things we see on-prem today.
My mind can't, I understand the concept and the principle of being able to roll out an update very quickly. But my mind can't fully grasp it. And that's because, so I wasn't always, on the vendor side. I used to do on-site engineering within the federal government, and I'm not going to name the specific programs, but, I did a lot within the PKI space. And when I thought about some of the ATOs that we would go through, And one of them that we were involved with was an 18-month cycle in order to get that ATO renewed for one of the critical PKI systems. And this wasn't unheard of. Now, this was a number of years ago. They've since taken a lot of corrective action to make that shorter. But during that time, 18 months, the system's almost frozen, right? There's not a lot that we can do as far as we can do some minimal patching, but we can't do major updates. Well, we can't operate like that and actually expect things to be secure. So changing that paradigm in the way that you can with things being so much more agile, it's baked into that DevSecOps cycle. This is not static, it's ever changing. We don't have to wait for a new big .version release. You know, I'm excited for it, but like I said, I'm still trying to actually process that because, you know, that's not what I was trained in.
Yeah. Ross, have you seen any exemplary programs or any good references of people doing it right across Fed?
So, you know, I'll speak just about close to home. We've got a few places that we deliver software. We have the CDM shared service, which provides CDM services for small and, you know, smaller agencies. We also have the dashboard, the federal dashboard, the Operate and ECS that produces the agency dashboards. And I have a lab at the NCCOE, the CDM lab at the NCCOE. And all three of those locations are moving to a DevSecOps mentality, right? I'm going to say that, you know, there are different paces. You know, some of them are farther ahead than others. I can say that, particularly in my NCCOE lab, it's been really amazing to watch the ability to use the DevSecOps methodology and how much it's made it so that I can operate in that lab much more efficiently. And you know, the MITRE operates that lab, and they've actually brought in some tools from a project that MITRE has called Caldera, where you can actually bring adversarial emulation into your environment. And so we're putting that in as parts of how we do our delivery of the systems that we test in that lab. And, you know, so it's a really full cycle, right? Because you actually get, not only do you build your system through a DevSecOps cycle, but then you emulate adversaries in that environment, which allows you to get feedback. Then you go back into your DevSecOps cycle and really kind of fix the things that the adversarial information is telling you. And that is, you know, that's as close to emulating the best practices of these kind of models that you can do. But I think, I mean, I just hear a lot of agencies, they are moving in that direction, right? They already were, right? I mean, there's a lot of agencies have very modern architecture. Some don't have as modern architectures. A lot of it kind of depends on the age of the platform that they're operating. You know, let's face it, more modern platforms more easily adopt, you know, a native DevSecOps model, whereas older platforms, for a lot of reasons, including the way their operations, their ConOps are built, and just the way their team operates, they don't have that. They don't operate in that same agile manner, right? And just like everything else, the government is a big space, and we have pretty much every kind of model of delivery, you know, that you can have. But I will say that as we move to the cloud, it becomes more. You're more easily able, and it's more urgent to adopt a DevSecOps mentality.
Yeah. So real quick, we got some of the poll results back. Josh, if you could pull those back up for us. And I'm a little bit shocked here. I mean,
it's good.
38% all set, ready to move forward. We're doing this. I mean, let's be honest, some really smart people at Google admitted it took them a decade to figure this out and get there. I guess we got it. I guess we all learned from their
38%. That, I mean, look, that means that, well, the way I read that is, if we'd had this question a year ago, it would have been a lot less, right? So people are paying attention to the zero trust methodology, the guidance that the agencies are producing. They're making sense. The industry is actually, you know, if you look at the industry analyst, they've been kind of converging on how to do this in a progressive manner, right? Starting with things that you can manage first. I think all of that conversation is making many more people comfortable with it, but 38% is not a majority, right? So there's still a lot of work to be done. And, some people are not sure because that's really a lot of where this space is. I mean, zero trust is not something that has been widely adopted. It is a philosophy that needs to be widely adopted, right? And so, you mentioned Google. Some companies are way down that path, right? They thought about this many years ago and they're working diligently to get there. The rest of us, we're kind of at the traditional space. And I think that was one of the really great parts about the maturity model, right? Is it kind of shows where you should be, at least at the beginning of this journey, right? To kind of think about each of these pillars in regards to where you should be, and even assess whether you're at that place with each of the pillars already, right? Before you move forward.
I read that question. I completely agree with everything, you just said, Ross. And I think an additional part of that question that I always look at too is the idea of readiness also means that you have people who have aligned mindset of, we want to do this, we want to move forward. Okay, maybe we don't have the tools, maybe we don't even understand exactly what architectures we need to put in place, but at least we have an acknowledgement of this is important. I always laugh because, a decade ago, I had walked into a deputy assistant director's office, and on the whiteboard, it just said cloud ? Because it was a concept. They had no idea what it was, right? And that wasn't too long ago that would have just said zero trust ? I'm sure. But we've had enough, and sadly, high profile incidents that people realized, oh, wow, if we would have taken a different approach, or if that commercial entity had taken a different approach, because it's not just, localized to the federal government, sadly, we probably could have prevented this, or at least made it where it wasn't nearly as painful. We think of just some very simple things and practices that we could have followed that are within this kind of zero trust maturity model that you're seeing here.
Yeah, completely agree. That's I got to stir the pot a little bit, folks. But so I guess let's. So for everyone in the audience, last time we were pounded with questions at this point and don't have anything yet. So I'm just gonna try and pull you guys out of your shells and start just lobbing some in. We can talk about this for hours, but again, we really want to help everybody else move some of this forward and answer some questions for you all. So with that, in our prep, we had talked a little bit about some of the playbooks that GSA has provided around identity and specifically around the DIRA playbook. Ross, can you go into a little bit about the digital identity risk assessment playbook and what that is, what that provides, and how that can help organizations moving forward on their zero trust journey?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. So last year, the ICAM subcommittee published a document that's called the Digital Identity Risk Assessment, and it helps agencies look at their applications that they're allowing people access to deliver services, and it helps them determine what level of assurance from an identity perspective they need to make sure people have both identity assurance and then the appropriate authenticators that they're using when they get access to that system, right? And I think that is really that kind of let's call it differential security is very important in zero trust, right? When we had this, perimeter network, everything on the inside was considered to be equally trusted. And the mechanism we were thinking about to get access to systems, it was really flat, right? You're going to have this authentication to get in, and then you can get access to everything that somebody's given you access to, right? Now we want to be a little more nuanced than that and make decisions, first of all, what is the type of data that I'm protecting in that application? And then, where does that application expose, right? Is it external users? You really need to think about what are you going to make sure you know about those users, and then how are you going to provide them authenticators, right? So I think those things really feed nicely into, first of all, the cloud strategy, and then secondly, the zero trust architecture. And in particular, I look at this as part of the maturity model, right? Is learning about your data. I mean, one of the things about the zero trust pillars is they're all intended to work together. There are, pillars, but they're not intended to be standalone functions, right? So the data in the data pillar and the network access defined in the network access pillar for the applications that are protecting that data in that pillar, right? It needs to be, all of it needs to be fed by the identity and the device layer, right? Particularly if those devices are, systems outside, if you're coming from the outside in, you really, all of those things come into context, right? And mentioned earlier about the policy decision points and the policy enforcement points, all the policies that are in each of those different domains, they need to align. So DERA does a really good job of kind of tying together, what is the sensitive your data, who's accessing the systems, and then what level of identity and authentication assurance you need to have when you're given access to those systems. It's just a really great thing. And I hope people pay attention to that because it helps a lot, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And as we get talked about previously, right, GSA is even offering to come into agencies to walk through this and help lead the exercises. Right, that's a lot of how GSA is learning about the challenges within the different agencies and using that as an opportunity to identify new tools, new capabilities, new playbooks to make everyone's lives easier moving forward. So I guess use it and abuse it is the best way to put it. But yeah, it's a 42+ page playbook that really walks through, and then even in the back there, I'm going to try and jump to it. Right, some discussions on continuous monitoring, right? Continuous deployment activities fall into that. Continuous ATO activities, which as we move towards the DevOps world, the fact that you don't have a big ATO event to field the system anymore, and you're just continually knocking them off and inheriting from systems. It's a new, different world we're leading into, where we've started doing it. It's been pretty great, to be honest. That 18-month wait that Brian talked about is it's still 18 months might be a little long, but it's a lot faster.
And there's a lot that my peers in the federal government and the industry are doing to help move that to a continuous authorization process, right? By taking information from the tools and sensors that are in operation, matching that with governance capabilities that organizations need to have, and kind of doing it as a data-driven methodology instead of, these big documents that sit on the wall, right? FedRAMP is working really hard in that regard. NIST, released OSCAL updates last year that are really important about how do you measure these things. I'm just saying there's a lot of things coming together in supporting, getting away from that 18-month kind of, ATO package, which it just doesn't really reflect the operational need or the security needs of the environments generally anymore, particularly as you start using environments that are repeated, right? That's one of the big differences, right? Is a lot of the infrastructural components are going to be authorized once and reused often, right, in cloud systems.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to drop into our second question for the poll here. So what is your agency or organization's most immediate need regarding identity and access management based on I think we can still call it recent executive order. I think there's some executive orders that are 3, 4, or 5 years old that we're still trying to get implemented in some cases. So we'll call it recent. So we'll let that come in a little bit here and jump into some of the next questions and kind of put, let's jump into this one first. So Brian, you talked about earlier some of the focuses on new authenticators to enable zero trust and moving away from all the traditional PIV and CAC cards that we all carry around all day and have been the basis of trust for 20+ years at this point, right? What are your thoughts on where we're going, why the changes now, and why it's going to give us something stronger than really that crypto piece of plastic that we've, honestly, it's still probably the strongest individual authenticator out there.
Yeah, I was about ready to say, careful what you say about it. I'm gonna pull up my. Oh, you can't see it because there it is. I've got test cards sitting on my desk, and I get the shakes if I don't have a PKI card near me, right? And of course, I've got the background where, I helped issue those things. Look, the reality is, and we'll walk through it, and I'll try not to make this too terribly boring and drawn out, but I could talk about PKI and smart cards all day. When it started, it was, as you said, it really is, and even today, I think it's the strongest enterprise grade authenticator that you could really implement. And I helped one of the major departments write out biometric, because we found they were using biometric fingerprint readers when you have it at the various levels that you need to have it at, when you have it with the liveliness test that you need to have it at, probability of matching and all that stuff. 3% of the population, it didn't work for. That may not sound like a ton, but 3% of nearly 100,000. I mean, it was nonstop work for the back end IT staff of trying to get these people to be able to access their everyday systems. So PKI doesn't necessarily have that same type of problem. The other thing is that constantly I'll hear, well, PKI just doesn't work, and I'll say, okay, well, the entire internet is based on PKI, so we know it works. The problem is, and the problem that's always been, is being able to leverage that authenticator on the platform that you're using or that application that you're using. Not everyone knows how to write their application in order to be able to work with an X509 certificate, right? That has been a persistent challenge. Now, 2 decades past really, some of the first implementations of smart cards, and we've gotten really good at fixing that problem. But when the mobile device came out, everyone said, "Well, how do I, right? How do I do this? This doesn't work." And there were different ways that we tried it, but that's when we started saying, "Okay, well, maybe we need to start looking at push authenticators on the mobile devices," and they were really easy. But then we started finding out, well, they're so easy, and unfortunately, people are so quick to click accept that it's also really easy to spoof a user and send them a legitimate challenge that they accept and not realize they just allowed an attacker to authenticate as them into a system, right? So that's why I think seeing, we saw the push of, hey, this needs to be easier. We need to have authenticators that work on more agnostic platforms than what the plastic cards could do. And now we're seeing that pushback of, wait a second, before we go too far down that road, we have to remember, there are very real attacks happening every single day across the federal government. Let's make sure we're using strong authenticators. But the other part about this that I always talk about is MFA, it's just one piece, right? It's not your identity. And I want to say that very critically, because I think that's something that, and I've been trying to educate people on that, especially when we talk about zero trust. This is not my digital identity. This is one piece that makes up that digital identity as a whole. And my digital identity can change multiple times throughout the day, depending on how I'm interacting with a system, right? We think back to some of that information that you had on the screen earlier, and we talked about kind of the optimal environments, and this idea of kind of dynamic pieces of information coming together. That's your actual identity. And I think that's been the greatest challenge for one, people to understand identity is not just that person behind the keyboard. It's not just this credential you hold, but it's all of these pieces kind of interplaying together to make up of who I really am when I'm interacting with a system and requesting data. So I critically, I can say we're not there yet, I think, collectively, in understanding and embracing that. I think we're getting better. I've been encouraged from what I've seen coming out from documentation, but I'll be critical in that I don't think it's explained that and push that hard enough for people to really understand. I'll say, for one, that was some of the feedback that Ping put in of, hey, we need to make sure people really understand what identity truly is and make sure that people are building that into their kind of ICAM mindset and policies.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. One of the things that was a real bellwether, I think, was NIST. When they published 863.3, it really helped people understand the different important elements of speaking about identity, right? And look, one thing I would agree 100% that the PIV Smart Card is a fantastic anchor of your identity, and it offers the ability to authenticate that identity assurance over and over with a high level of assurance, right? And so those two things are really foundational for organizations like the federal government. And look, I know a lot of industries, oil and gas industry comes to mind, a lot of financial services industries, the healthcare profession more and more is using, they need to have this really high assurance credential that anchors the people that are operating within their domain of control, right? But it's not everything, right? So I have a mobile phone here and I have a drive PIV on it, right? And that's a different form factor. It doesn't have anything about my person on it, right? But it operates with that same kind of X509. But even then, that's only certain systems can use that kind of authentication methodology. And there's a lot of, federation type of interactions using OpenID Connect, authorization models like OAuth that we need to accommodate, that actually the government could do well to speak more about those secondary functions, right? And I'd like to see a little bit more clarity on 863B about which one of these, how to select factors more discreetly. It's not in the main document. A lot of that's in the implementation resources guides. I think 863.4 will update some of that. And then there's a lot of work, like I said, around, federation, these secondary uses of sessions and authentications after the authentication, right?
Yeah, I'd love to see. So in 63.3, right, they had 3 separate documents. This gets really confusing when you try to explain people like 63A. Well, what rev do you mean? Well, I mean, the one where it's split out IAL, AAL, and FAL. So I think we've gotten really good. The federal government, I think, is one of the leaders in IAL, right? That's not something that we necessarily see or embrace over on the commercial side. It's usually like, well, we vet a little bit, or we'll check them against, these various TransUnion or whatever databases. But this idea of multiple different types of vetting and the depth of vetting that the federal government will go through, it's just not seen as much. Then AAL, obviously we've got this rich suite, and you use your IAL and then you get an AAL, and then that's usually where the conversation stops, and people forget about 63C. And I've always said that, unfortunately, it's probably because people got tired of reading it and they got to the C document, so well, I'm done. That should probably be your A document, because the reality is that you shouldn't have to worry about whether or not your application works with any of the authenticators listed in 63B, right? And you shouldn't have to worry about your applications being able to understand the identity vetting that went through on 63A. Your federation system, which, more and more we're seeing that the guidance and policy saying you should be using, should be able to look up all of that for you and enable all of that for you. And that, I think, is where we're going to see, hopefully, finally, some of the last challenges of leveraging X509 and other very strong cryptographic authenticators, not just physical smart cards or even derived, being able to be leveraged across your actual application environment. And that's really, that's always been the solution. And I think, more people are going to suddenly realize, oh, there aren't these challenges that we once thought. We just need to use SAML. We just need to use OpenID Connect, right? We just need to use these kind of modern federation standards, and all of those go away, or at least become a lot less challenging than what we once thought.
And Matt, that brings me back to where you and I started, a couple of years ago. We got reacquainted with each other, and it was around zero trust, right? It's around the post-authentication work, right? I've gotten authentication. We have an IDP that's given me an authentication. All the work you and I've been talking about primarily has been about what do you do after that, right? Whether it's, how do you use federation capabilities, how you bring different information sources in, zero trust in effect.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So, gosh, we could, as the last time, right? We could go on for hours, but we do have to get these questions in so people can get their CPs. Y'all could pull back the poll results from our last question, which is, what is your agency/organization's most immediate need regarding identity and access management? And dead on even for, I'm really not sure, and all of the above. So the way I read that is everything and nothing.
Yeah,
that's not.
And I think this poll question is really good because identity and access management has been, targeted in 3 different areas, right? In the EO, and then in successive, requirements from the government. Critical software depends, it's again at the top of the pillar, right? About using identity that you can actually ensure that the software is being developed by, first what the critical software is, and then that has proper identity and access controls on it, right? Enterprise identity, having an enterprise approach is really important, right? And then finally, we just talked about a multi-factor authentication. They all are very important, right? You can choose to start in any one of those places and you'll aid and you're able to get there everywhere else, right? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
If I can be so bold, though, I will say, I fall in the E camp of I'm not sure. And the reason why I say that, is I don't think we've done a good enough job of really understanding what's in our environment. So we know we've got critical software. Okay, where is it? How much critical software do we have? That's a question that I think the vast majority of organizations probably can't answer with 100% certainty, right? When we need to use the enterprise-wide identity, we have to know what applications are actually in our environment, right? And in order to adopt that MFA, we need to know, right? So there's this gap of knowledge of what actually encompasses our IT, where our actual, to use old school term of perimeter is, right? I subscribe to identity as the new perimeter, but you have to understand how users are able to connect to the environment before you can address that. And, I will say, this is where I get to be optimistic, is that we're seeing engagement at the higher levels now. We're seeing CIOs, we're seeing CISOs come in and say, tell me what applications aren't enabled. Where are they? Who's interacting with them? And that's, now drawing that intention of, okay, we have to first have that blueprint of where we are before we know where our most critical need is moving forward. And obviously that's going to be an ever developing story. I don't think anyone will ever say, yeah, we have everything absolutely exactly known. The moment you have that ideology, you're already falling behind anyway. But yeah, I would say I'm not like, I don't want E to be the correct answer. But, I can totally understand why we're seeing so many people saying that. And I think I would be saying the same thing if I were in people's shoes.
Yeah. And yeah, it's just a lot. I will say, coming back to the security measures for critical software, we have seen right in the last couple of days some very strong vulnerability recommendations, reporting, templates coming out of CISA and moving a lot of that forward. There's been a ton of discussion around enforcing software bill of materials and signing those from the vendors and coming out. I actually would love to challenge the government to go even further on that, right? And the policies that we're defining and putting out to our policy decision points should also be signed, right? And if you're not using signed policies that come from the whatever you deem your authoritative source, which honestly can be as simple as a Git repository with, right, a central location that those get pulled from for each application, or bundled as part of your application and signed to be validated, that's pretty darn strong. Like, you don't have a signed policy, this thing doesn't go on the network, period, right? And we're actually able to do that today, even with non-cloud environments, which I think is incredibly powerful and one of the big things I'm looking forward to moving forward. So with 15 minutes left, I am going to ask that we pull up the third question so that we can talk for 15 minutes and then rush to kind of squeeze it in at the end, because that's what we're really good at. But Ross, I'm going to ask you, a lot of what I have seen lately with agencies' first moves to zero trust has been around software-defined networking, SASE type environments, right? We can insert, I'll just pull up as we talk here, the Peacock diagram, as we like to call it, across all of the identity space. And there's probably 80% of the vendors across the pillars missing in each one of these peacock feathers. But a lot have been focusing within that network side, the SASE, CASB, SDP, TIC 3.0 compliance type stuff. I'm biased, but I think it's the wrong place to start. Do you have any thoughts on why that's happening that way?
You know, it's one of the reasons it has a really strong, it resonates strongly in the federal space is because the federal government and, DHS had the trusted internet connection, and we had, there was a lot invested in it, and it still operates and gives us a lot of value. And, we set up certain expectations about what we get from that infrastructure, right? So we necessarily had to describe how the trusted internet connection would migrate from its, the where it was to where it needs to be. And we needed to do that, pronto, right? Because the policies around the structure of it before weren't aiding in our moving to a new environment, right? So that, I don't know if you were not part of the federal government and you didn't have this, this environment that you could actually leverage, this wouldn't be a consideration for you as strongly as it is for the federal government. But that being said, it's these other areas are all, very important too. And I think, I think they all work in concert, right? That's one of the challenges is you move here, all these pillars are important, right? So you have to move in each one of them, I'll say the way we described the Trusted Internet Connection 3 is probably leaning in that area because that's what it is intended to describe. But these other areas, identity and device identity, are the two kind of in places that are easy to work on because the government has issued devices and they know they have a process for doing that. And now you can leverage that devices by getting, doing things like putting mobile threat detection on them, having an understanding of whether that device is known or not when it comes on the network. Those are really important and not very complicated or difficult things to do around bringing device capabilities up to snuff. And it works in concert with identity. And remember, I talked about the way these pillars all have to work together. That's a great example of two capabilities that almost every cloud service provider or identity as a service provider can offer to agencies kind of right out of the box, right? You know what I mean? And then, then the other two things that are on the right-hand side, that you're spot on, Brian, about the context, right? And it is hard, but it's getting easier, right? It was really, when I first started, when I was at ICE and I tried to bring SSO into ICE, I had to manually ask people, what were the SSO, what were the applications that I could put behind my SSO, right? And it was, it was like asking people. It wasn't like there was no way to do discovery to find it, right? Nowadays there are discovery tools. And the discovery tools are they're all over the place. They come from different domains, right? A lot of the tools that you put in your environment these days, whether it's on-premise environments and cloud environments, they can do discovery for where you have assets going now. And even back to the network, right? Some of these net flow tools can determine, hey, you've got flow going out to this thing. You didn't know it, right? It's at Salesforce and you didn't tell me about the Salesforce application they're using, right? So there's a lot of capabilities and some of them are in the network that you can actually help build the kind of this overall picture about where your sensitive assets are,
Yeah. Brian, did you have any thoughts on why we're seeing a lot of people going with that network layer? And I'll throw my 2 cents in, like people understand VPNs and they go, oh, it's the next VPN and it's easier to understand, but I'll let you talk a little.
I guess I'll speak personally. It's a little bit of a comfort factor. I gotta say, like, I always felt really good knowing that all of my PKI servers, my critical pieces, were sitting not only in this hamster cage, 360 degrees, lift up the floorboards, make sure the cage goes underneath, but that we had 2 great big firewalls. They were physical things that you could see, and they were huge, right? And those firewalls protected my environment, and I knew what was coming in and out of it, right? So that was a comfort factor. Now, we had a lot of other things that we had to do inside of that cage, and we had a lot of 2-party controls and everything else to make sure that, from an identity aspect, from physical control and logical control, that it was actually secured. But it was really easy to do that one layer with the firewall. And that again goes back to this concept of, well, we'll just make the perimeter really, really strong. And we know we can do that because, everything is self-contained. That's not the world we live in anymore, but that's still a lot of mindset, right? I still fight with that on a daily basis of thinking things in that way. So what I like about this, and I think this is one of the benefits, when you go down to the optimal state, it looks like everything is the same. Use machine learning, continuous validation, constant device security monitor, right? Real-time risk analytic. It's all the same thing, because when you get down to that level, it's everything kind of blends together, right? When an identity system, we should be able to look at our identity system. We should be able to do real-time kind of, well, I always say real-time, but the reality is nothing's ever perfectly real-time, but as close to real-time as we can, analytics of how that system's operating. And we can have historical data on it, right? That's this idea of machine learning and heuristics. And if all of a sudden my identity system is putting in assertions that it's never done before, or granting access to a different system that's never done before, then we can actually have policy built in, right? That's a part of the zero trust model of, hey, maybe we should stop that session. So this goes beyond, hey, I've already authenticated as a user, but all of a sudden things are deviating beyond the way they should. I'm accessing things that I shouldn't be accessing and haven't historically accessed. I can terminate that session, even though I'm not going to prompt them to show their MFA again, right? That's that power of what we're moving towards. Now, granted, it's going to be a process, and it's going to be an ever evolving process. We're never going to get there. And that's a good
Yeah.
thing, right? We shouldn't ever feel like we've got it and it's checked off. But I think that's why. I rambled a bit there, but when I think back and I put back on my hat of, hey, I'm back in that PK environment, what made me feel good and what was really easy to implement. And I say that tongue in cheek because we all know networking is incredibly difficult, but I think that's why we still have that focus and we're still fighting that today.
Yeah. So, all right, we got 8 minutes left. As always, this flew by. So let's pull up that third question, make sure everyone's got answers around their CPE credits that we can check the boxes for everyone. Josh, if you would mind. There we go. So what level of urgency for your agency and organization is there to adopt cloud services? A high sense of urgency, and we started years ago. A sense of urgency, but we're just getting started, and we've got a measured approach, moving one application at a time. Nobody's waiting for the market to mature. I love that was a big fat zero, because it's here to stay, even though it is just somebody else's computer. And then a cloud risk for modern plans. I bet you I can guess which agency that one person is actually coming from, and they probably have a real good justification too. So, any surprises, team, on these answers?
No, actually, it really kind of aligns with what I like to see. I mean, some people do have a high sense of urgency. I've worked with a few agencies that are really moving there with a bullet, right? You know what I mean? And they have good reason to do that, right? And other agencies, and a lot of the big agencies, look, they're taking an approach of, this is an application. It's an important application to me. I've done others, so I have the pattern that I'm going to do, and I'm going to move that there, right? And I think that makes good sense. Yeah, it all just makes really good sense to me. There's no right answer to this one, right? You know what I mean?
Well, and the other part about it too is I think people get so hung up on the word cloud in cloud services, and yeah, big part of that is moving to the cloud. But we also got floating data centers. We typically call them like aircraft carriers and warships, but they're self-contained data centers. And if you think that cloud services isn't important to them because they have to be able to operate fully independent of external resources, that's not true. That's that idea of DevSecOps. It's that idea of let's leverage what we've learned and what we've developed by being able to do things at scale within a cloud environment. Let's do that fully self-contained within an air gapped. So yeah, I'm not surprised. The measured approach, I think, makes sense. Again, I'd probably fall in the paranoid camp of, hey, I'm really scared about the security implications of cloud. But that's just because I'm a paranoid individual, come from that background. But yeah, measured approach makes sense, and I think we always have to balance speed and risk. But I think the only point I wanted to make in there is again, for agencies, when they talk about cloud, they need to talk about cloud strategies, not just the actual FedRAMP or even any other type of public cloud service. But but what we've learned, what we've developed, so we can reduce. Again, I'm going to hammer on those ATOs. We cannot continue to operate in an environment that takes us so long to be able to bring in critical patches. We have to be more dynamic, more flexible, and that's only going to be able to be accomplished by leveraging these things that industry's already figured out and are already implemented.
All right, we got 5 to go. Oh, sorry, go ahead, Ross.
I was going to say, Brian made me chuckle because I remember having a conversation about someone who had an air gap system, and then they told me I'd get access to it, right?
Yeah, I'm not. Yeah,
and it wasn't going through a door, right?
We got some interesting things going on in the DoD right now. They're opening up some air gaps that are actually very well protected. So, I would love for people to dig in a little bit more on the CNAP documents from Air Force. So, Brian, Ping sponsored us today. I'm going to give you a couple seconds, but to just tell us how Ping can help on this zero trust journey. But first, I will want to say a little bit about, as we are moving forward with identity, think about what cloud providers you might be using to deliver for identity, and what happens to your organization if they go down. I know from a commercial perspective, large automotive company standardized on one of those large cloud identity providers, and last year wrote off millions of dollars of missed production line time because that cloud provider went down and their people on the line couldn't log in. And they said, if I can't log in, I can't clock in. You're not going to pay me. I'll see you tomorrow. And right, that's a very different thing than what we would see in the federal government. But at the same time, if we're using some of those cloud providers and don't think about a hybrid strategy, so I'll just throw that out there for the group to think about. We'll leave that one. But Brian, I'll give you 2.5 minutes now so we can then come back and wrap up.
Yeah, I was going to say this difference between OT and IT. IT says we've got 5 nines. OT says we never go down because it's $1 million a minute if we do, or something like that. No, so one of the things that drew me to Ping, one of the reasons why I really felt like, hey, Ping was where I think we can make a big difference, is their approach towards identity. And it's not just, hey, it's just Ping. It's this idea of having a rich suite of technical partners, understanding that, it needs to cross multiple different types of existing infrastructure. It's one of the things we always talk about: bring your own authenticator. Hey, a part of the identity strategy, you've already implemented some form of MFA, especially in the federal government. Why should you have to re-enroll? Let's leverage what you've already built, enhance it, and bring it into a zero trust model. The other part about it is understanding we cannot just have blind inherent trust within, especially our federation system. We have to be able to have this idea of continuous monitoring. We need to have it baked in where we can look at, kind of what I talked about before, whether or not we're having different types of assertions being put in place, whether or not it's deviating, being able to look at things from an API level of, hey, what applications are requesting access to what type of data through the APIs. We can monitor that. And, build that into that workflow, build that into that federation hub, build that into your PDPs and your PEPs, and be able to actually deploy that within an infrastructure that you already have without having to fully rip and replace everything. Sure, there may be some systems that eventually could be replaced or stood down, but more often than not, those legacy systems will end up paying for the implementation of your zero trust products once you get that renewal out of the way. I hate to say it, but some of those legacy systems, just in personnel cost, are incredibly intensive. So yeah, I would say that's what Ping kind of does, what we specialize in. There's very few things we don't integrate with well. But yeah, and the last thing I'll say is, thank you for allowing us to sponsor this. It was great. I learned a lot. Hopefully, our attendees learned something from this and took away something as well they can use for their organizations.
Yeah, I think we have another great one here for the Caresoft podcast series. So, Ross, any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
It's just keep moving on, right? There's a lot of new stuff out, and sometimes it can seem overwhelming. If for each agency you have a plan, try to find out how you can contribute to that plan that your agency is moving forward with, right? Be positive and just get it done.
Awesome. Well, thank you again, everybody. Thank you to all the attendees. I am going to beat the attendees up. We didn't get questions this time. If we do this again, I'm forcing questions and I'm going to make awkward pauses. So we'll turn it back to the team at Carosoft to wrap us up and check us out. Thanks again, everyone.
Thanks, Ross, Matt, and Brian, for your participation. I want to thank all of our participants for joining us today. We hope that you found this webcast informative and helpful to you and your organization. Please take a moment to answer the questions on your screen. We appreciate your feedback. For those who met the CPE requirements today, you will receive your certificate of completion within 2 weeks. If you have any further questions or would like to request more information, please feel free to contact us. Our contact information is being displayed at the bottom of your screen, so please don't hesitate to call or email us. And finally, in the next day or two, we will be emailing you all a link to an archived version of this webcast, along with a few additional resources so you can review it or pass it along to a colleague. Thank you again for attending.
Thanks, bye.